Today, we're looking at the relationship between storytelling, lighting, and emotion. A story without emotion isn't a story at all. People need to feel something when they see your photos because if they don't feel anything, they don't really care. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's take a step back and talk about exposure. An overexposed photo occurs when too much light from your scene is recorded by your camera sensor. An underexposed photo occurs when not enough light is recorded, which means a correctly exposed photo fits into that sweet spot in the middle. That's how photography gets taught, right? That's how I learned photography. But that way of thinking can be really limiting when you're trying to tell a story and trying to evoke an emotional response from your audience. A correctly exposed photo has little character, it's not interesting, it's not mysterious, and that's because the correctness is determined by your camera believing that every single scene you photograph should average out to something called middle grey. Grey. I mean, that's pretty much the definition of dull, right? To tell a grey story, you have to break away from this idea of a technically correct exposure and instead learn how to use lighting to convey your emotions. And it's actually not that hard. Basically, this is it, in a nutshell. An abundance of light is linked to positive emotions, whereas the absence of light in a scene is typically an indicator of negative emotions. In fact, I can make it even more concise than that. Light is good, dark is evil. And this relationship between light and emotions is everywhere. It's in our everyday language. Think of expressions like, she lit up a room as she walked into it, or he was feeling in a dark mood, or you're the light of my life. As photographers, we need to be able to translate these emotions into our work. And we're going to start by doing that today by looking at 3 skills that'll help you do just that. Let's start by talking about something called exposure ratios. The exposure ratio is the relationship between the highlight side on the scene and the shadow area on a scene or subject. Let me show you exactly what I mean. This scene is now very well and very evenly lit. I've done 3 things here. The obvious one is I've changed my background to white, which means that more light is bouncing around and filling in the shadows. I've also added a white card over here, so now my key light is bouncing a bit into that and filling in the shadow side of my face. The last thing I did was shoot this at a warmer white balance. Warmer colors can make people feel happier, but colors is a whole other video. The end result here is that the difference between the highlight side and the shadow side has been narrowed, and that was the point. The highlights on my face are now only twice as bright as the shadows, which is why this is called a 2-to-1 exposure ratio. The thing about this style of lighting is, well, it's not very interesting to look at. It's basically sitcom lighting, and the reasons sitcoms light things up evenly is because they don't want to create any negative emotions. Remember, light is good, dark is evil. So if you're the producer of a sitcom, you definitely don't want your lighting to be feeding through negative emotions to your audience. I mean, it's meant to be a comedy. To make this setup more dramatic and way more interesting, we need to bring in some darkness. Dramatic visual storytelling tends to use higher exposure ratios that visually communicate the broader emotional range of those shows. So to recreate that vibe here, I've done 2 things. I've changed my backdrop back to black, and that's going to stop any reflected light creeping into my shadows. I've also turned down my fill light, which is the one coming from this direction. So I now have an 8-to-1 exposure ratio. The intensity of my key light, this one, which is on my highlight side, hasn't actually changed at all, it's the same intensity. But the shadow side, which is this one, is now 1/8 as bright, thus the 8-to-1 ratio. Let's check those out side by side. The 2-to-1 ratio is pretty flat, just enough shadow to show some depth and some facial features. The 8-to-1 ratio carves out the face a lot more, it's starting to add depth to my character. The shadows on the face are also starting to blend into my background now. And this type of light setup, when combined with the appropriate context, pose, facial expressions, will draw a viewer in way more as they try and make sense of that scene. Right, So that's the exposure ratio done, the first step in using light to create an emotional response. Remember, exposure ratio sets the mood. If you choose a 2:1 ratio, you're likely looking at lighter emotions. But a steeper ratio, like 8:1, that's starting to convey darker, way more complex emotions. Our second topic is quality of light. Quality of light runs on a spectrum that goes from hard all the way to soft light. A large light source, like the softbox I'm using here, produces a soft light. This term soft describes the boundary between the highlight and the shadow areas. As you can see, it's a very gradual or soft boundary. Soft light is primarily associated with positive emotions. It's more warm, welcoming, and friendly. Because it comes from a larger source, it wraps around the subject, bathing them in light. This smooths out the wrinkles and makes the subject look younger. The extra light also reaches into the eyes and makes the model look more vibrant, more happy, more positive. If I remove this Wesker umbrella and the diffusion panel, we're left with a much smaller light source. No diffusion panel to increase its size. We've actually gone from a light source that was 43 inches across to one that's just 3 or 4 inches across. That's a big difference, and it results in a much harder light falling on Dan's face. Look at the boundary between the highlight and the shadow areas now. It's much more visible, more solid. Hard light is much more intense. Because it comes from a smaller source, it can't wrap around our model. That inability to light up some parts of the face is what creates those harsh boundaries between the highlights and the shadows. From a storytelling perspective, these harsher boundaries are quite aggressive statements. They might imply a harder side to the character or an uncomfortable situation that character is in. As a storyteller, you should think of these dark shadow areas as a space where the character can be developed, where you can add complexity. You can fill those spaces with whatever emotions you want. Mystery, fear, sadness. You can't do that in an evenly lit photo because everything is already on display, everything is visible. The last characteristic of light you need to understand is its direction. The way you position your light around your subject, both in a horizontal and a vertical plane, will affect how a viewer emotionally interprets your photo. The common butterfly lighting setup is fairly emotionally neutral. By that I mean it doesn't elicit much in the way of emotions. That's actually why they're used in fashion. They're very flattering because the angle ensures as few shadows are created on the face as possible. But from a storytelling perspective, they're not so interesting. There's no mystery or drama here. But when we move our light further to the side of our model, and keep a steep ratio, then things start to get more interesting. This is a Rembrandt light setup, named after the classical painter. You can tell because of the little triangle of light that appears on the opposing cheek to your key light. The more we move that around Dan, the more you start seeing shadows on the opposing side of the face. Right now, the light isn't reaching the far side of Dan's face, which gives him a mysterious, darker side. I'm using a rim light on the right in these photos to bring back some subject separation from the darker side of the scene. My rim light is just a bare bulb. This ensures that the light from it won't wrap around the subject and fill in any of the shadows I'm trying to keep in shadow. What if we want to step things up emotionally though, and move from this light setup to something even more intense? To do that, we need to move the light up and above Dan. That way we can bring those shadows over his eyes and his mouth. As humans, we make evaluations of people primarily based on their facial features. Is that person smiling or are they angry? But if these features are hidden or obscured, we become uncomfortable and our evaluations skew to the negative. This type of lighting takes advantage of that emotional response. Can you see how different this is when you look at it from a storytelling perspective? In our last photo, we'd given Dan a light setup that would work well for a mysterious character, but not necessarily an evil one. This setup, however, very clearly says do not trust this character. Sorry, Dan. When I light a scene for a photo, I start by looking for the emotional crux. What is my character feeling right now, individually or as a group? Then I try to create a light setup around them that reinforces or amplifies those emotions. At the beginning of this video, I explained why I thought this idea of a correct exposure was irrelevant for storytelling. A photo like this illustrates my point. From a textbook perspective, it's poorly exposed, but from a storytelling perspective, it is exactly what I was looking for, as it matches the emotions I thought that character was feeling at the time in that story. As a portrait photographer, you're capturing moments, one frame in a larger story. Sometimes those moments speak for themselves, but more often than not, they need context. Lighting is a way to add that context. It's a way to visually display the emotion in your story so your viewer feels it, and that's how you get people to really engage with your work. Thanks a lot.